This is not how you make magic, guys.
Go for it. Go for it, Rich.
this
From the man who used to want to do the intro and then we're like, no, I'm good. Like, go for it. Take it away, my friend.
No, I'm just saying, like, you're trying to, create some sort of methodology behind magic. But, these cold opens have to happen natural.
Do they? Do they need to be natural?
Yeah. Everything I do is natural. I don't even prep for this thing anymore. I barely made it today.
That's true. Yeah, that's fair.
Welcome to the show, where air takes the floor. Lee and Rich on the mic.
Welcome to the AI Guys podcast, where we make artificial intelligence easy to understand for everyone. I'm your host, Lee Dixon, and as always, I'm joined by the 1990 Lutheran High School of Hawaii surfing team captain, Rich Swire. I couldn't even get that one out today.
No,
man.
That was weak.
That was weak. That's such a deep cut. Don't tell me that was weak. I thought that was fantastic. But how long your high school was to add in surfing team captain?
Lutheran High School.
It broke me up.
Yeah. Well, it was easy to become captain because there was like 20 kids in my class.
Yeah. Oh man, I need some highlights. If that exists somewhere, I need it.
All right, there's a picture.
Perfect. Well, our guest today is not going to be talking about surfing. Actually, he is on a mission to transform how AI supports patients, clinics, and healthcare systems. By day, he's leveraging AI to improve the healthcare outcomes, and by night, he's a tech-savvy dad, pet wrangler, and an aspiring game developer at times. With over 10 years of leadership within the Harris Group for Constellation Software, and currently the Executive Vice President of Artificial Intelligence at Altera Digital Health, Ben Scharfe, welcome to the pod.
I'm so excited to be here. And while we won't talk about surfing, I have been talking a lot about, riding the wave, right?
Oh, this guy is a trained professional.
He's a natural.
You don't want to let AI kind of crash over your business or yourself, right? You want to ride that wave.
Oh, dude.
I love it. God,
all right, we did an episode a couple weeks back on like the auto industry, and I don't remember how many puns we actually fit in at some point.
Right.
But let's see if we can hang 10 today. All right. We're going to dive right in. With your background, Ben, I would love for you to kind of give a little brief overview on that. But for those that are, jumping into the episode, we are going to focus a little bit on healthcare today and how it can support a variety of different areas of the healthcare space. So if you don't mind, Ben, just painting a quick picture and then we'll dive right in.
Yeah, so for the last 10 years, I've been working primarily in the ambulatory space. So for people to differentiate, that's rather than hospitals, more so if you go to a clinic on the street corner or whatever, go see your doctor, your family physician, etc. That's the area that I focus on. So I started out in finance, leading our finance function for an ambulatory portfolio of EHR and practice management systems. And we acquired a number of these softwares over the years. And then over the last couple of years, I've been working at Altera, which is, a very large, business that we acquired, including TouchWorks. So that was the ambulatory system that we acquired. So I managed TouchWorks for the last several years. And then as part of that, we started to do a lot of work with AI over the last few years. And just, in November, I switched to a role just leading AI for all of Altera. And so working with folks like yourselves and working with our peers at Harris to just see how we can use it a lot internally, to kind of speed up our development cycles and be more responsive to our clients. And then also, right now we're really excited about how we can use it to help transform healthcare and help make the lives of clinicians and patients better.
One of the obviously we've had past episodes that talk about CAIOs and this kind of new role and this new position of how AI is becoming it's its own creature. It goes across all the different, different sections of a business because it is transformative, but it's not necessarily just technology, right? It also
creeps into everything now.
It impacts more business side because of the nature of what it does, specifically, the ability to use it almost like a digital employee or a workforce that can actually change your business. So what has it been like? I mean, what are your big challenges when it comes to kind of taking on this new role? Like, what's the vision around how maybe your company and maybe potentially other companies in healthcare are looking at AI? I know you recently went to HIMSS and you've been to a few conferences. Like, what's the buzz on the street as far as how people are looking at this?
Finger on the pulse, maybe.
There we go.
What would be the surfing equivalent? So I'd say so the main hurdles, right? So I'd say the biggest one is just trust, comfort, and compliance. And so legislation is sort of a really evolving, there's a lot of emergent legislation that people are not really sure 100% kind of where that's going to land. I'd say the other kind of major hurdle is just the human element, right? People being comfortable and kind of confident and able to really confidently rely on AI. But, focusing on the compliance element, in general, just security, right? Data privacy is really something that people are very sensitive to. It's obviously kind of critical from a compliance standpoint in healthcare. And the reality, right, is that all of these consumer AI products are, intended to train on everything that gets put into them, right? So they can get smarter and better over time. And so that we can keep getting at these, the Gemini 2.5 Pro, right? Like that we train on the prompt data to get better. But in healthcare, we don't really want to do that, right? So it's a sort of important delineation, and where we need to really use enterprise security, use these enterprise APIs where we're not, training on any of that sensitive data. So that's, I think, something that, generally people are just, there's a level of comfort or discomfort with, just how we handle AI and how we handle prompt data and sensitive like healthcare information. And then kind of going a bit further with the compliance, there at the federal level, there is some compliance, right, through HTI-1, through some of the healthcare kind of established mandates, but the federal government hasn't gone that kind of next step in really giving more comprehensive legislative guidance around artificial intelligence. And with the change in administration, there was sort of a signal of, well, we're more interested in deregulating. Like, we don't want to, have a really heavy-handed regulatory framework, which initially I kind of looked at that as like, that's encouraging, right? As an AI innovator, like I was sort of excited about that. But the reality has been that now the states are just kind of stepping up and doing their own legislation. So it creates this maze where there's like all of these different state legislations being introduced. So in my, home state of Missouri, there's legislation that like in somewhere buried in there is like, you can't marry AI. So like, let's just cross that off the list.
Never move into Missouri. Got it.
Exactly. I was like, oh man, my hopes and dreams. So it's really like all over the place, right? And it makes compliance really hard if you're, to navigate as far as like making sure you're complying with like 100 different, legislative frameworks.
Yeah, the complexity of this seems like, I guess it's no different than, I'm sure you guys have been through this, maybe through the phase of obviously, with the mobile phones, right? Like I remember back in the day when, every nurse and had like pagers, like those pagers were still a thing, right? And that was like a secure environment. And then
they still are. Actually, in places.
Yeah. And then eventually they started saying, oh, okay, yeah, we can actually use iPhones, and for patient communication or
the iPad and just having like tablet wandering around.
Yeah, that same shift of like adoption that's kind of inevitable, right? Like, okay, come on, we're going to have to at some point adopt the iPhone. It's not a matter of if, but when. But the amount of work that was required to reimagine what the world looks like with that to make sure it meets compliance. It seems like that's probably very similar to what AI is, but obviously AI brings in this kind of more obtuseness because it's not something that's isolated in one singular device or potentially one singular, or two companies, right? Google and Android and iPhone. Now you're talking about a multitude of different tools. And so there's probably like a non-zero chance that, within any sort of environment, organization, there's probably a lot of people using a lot of different AI tools, not even knowing it, right? And that, I don't know how big of a, what you need to deploy or inject into that from a compliance that makes it easy to wrangle those issues into it. So it's quite a feat, I assume.
It also might be something too when you're looking at like, we talk a lot about if you could go back and reimagine something AI first, how would it look? Right. And so when you're putting this in the hands of, we're talking right now on the legislation side, but when you're putting it in the hands of the people that typically don't know the tech side that well, and they're the ones leading the charge on how to make something AI first, it also muddies the waters very quickly, throwing in additional pieces that aren't necessarily, moving any narrative forward, but instead kind of murking the waters a little bit, is tough. So I think, when you were talking about, in the beginning, this kind of communication layer, like making people comfortable with it, do you feel like inside of the healthcare space, there's more of a pushback internally from, the providers actually providing care and trying to be like, do we want to use this, but we really don't know where it fits? Do you feel like it's more so on the patient side where they're like, I don't want to be talking to a robot, as leading my care if I'm trying to have a very human experience? Or do you think it's something more than that?
I think it's a mixture, right? So I'm really interested in this concept of like the technology adoption curve, right? Like as with anything, right? It kind of follows like a normal distribution where you have people who are like bleeding edge, they want the tech, right? They want to experiment. And you got people on the other side who are like, I'll never let a robot tell me, what to do or whatever. And then like everyone in the middle, right? So with patients, certainly there's people who are like, I don't want that dang robot listening to my, conversation. And then you've got other people who are like, okay, exactly, right. but then you've got people who recognize that, I mean, essentially the care experience can really be transformed in that if on one side you've got traditional kind of EHR robust documentation where the clinician spends a lot of time kind of looking at the computer and like typing and clicking boxes and stuff while they're kind of like they're like talking to the patient like, how are you feeling, and like looking over here, right? Whereas with ambient listening, for example, which is sort of a major, use case of AI in healthcare, it's basically that like face-to-face just conversation, much more natural, much more connected. And then a lot of the documentation can be then kind of automated, streamlined. And another interesting thing is we can help providers prepare, more rapidly for visits by summarizing the patient chart, giving them like, a really quick kind of look. And then so you've got a clinician who can come in a little more fresh, like, a little less like frazzled, a little less rushed, and then connect more with the patient, kind of have that eye contact, really try to help influence some of their, self-care, health decisions that they make to better comply with health plans, et cetera. So, I mean, yeah, I'd say that there is, you've got clinicians who are, certainly going to take their time to adopt. But in general, just recently I was listening to some folks talk from the EHR Association, and their doctor, Dr. Spiker, was saying, we're tired of being left behind. Like in healthcare, like physicians are always, it's always like there's a slowness of bringing tech into healthcare, and they don't want to be left behind. They want that they use AI in their day-to-day lives, and they want the tools.
Yeah.
I will. One last thing on that I'll just say is that the legal side is certainly an area where, especially in healthcare, because of liability, I'd say that's another part of, where there's a lot of resistance and a lot of like, whoa, let's be careful.
Yeah. I mean, you make some really excellent points. And I think, I can get just from my personal experience, I have like two major, when I'm thinking about healthcare specifically, one thing I've always kind of wondered is like, there's so much emphasis on protecting my personal information, but yet there's this massive gap in delivering really quality service, from the medical world, at least my experience. And what I mean by that is like I had a friend that went to the hospital this weekend, right? And he gets 5 or 6 different pages from his doctor, and the doctor was saying certain things, but the wife was just not understanding, like, okay, like he's saying a lot of big words. And so the first thing that we did was we took a picture of these documents and used ChatGPT and said, tell me what the heck this is saying, and what's the, and how do we solve this problem? And it was 100 times better than what the doctor was saying. The wife was able to kind of calm down and understand what the plan was. I was able to communicate to my friend what was going on, because he had a multitude of things. Yeah. And so I wonder, like, at that moment in time, and I don't know if that's just me disconnected, I'm more of a consumer here talking, I'm not in the industry, but at that moment in time, I'm sitting here going, who cares about my private information at that point? Like, are we seriously sitting here going, like, I'd rather sacrifice privacy that somebody might find out that I'm overweight than, that I actually can deliver high quality service through a combination of using AI to interpret what's going on, but also, like you mentioned, ambient listening and all these other things. And then, of course, he has to go to 3 more doctors, right? Because he's got other issues that stemmed from this one acute issue that he has. And then combining all of that, basically what's going to happen is the patient is going to go on ChatGPT. It's kind of like the new version of going on Google, Googling and going to
this is your new WebMD.
Yeah, going, I've got pain in my. I mean, have we gotten to the point now? And I would say, I would argue that if you asked 100 people, they probably would say that I Google, or now I use AI to diagnose me, and I trust that more than I trust my doctor. And I think that inflection point is a serious kind of like point where you have to like reevaluate things and go, okay, guys, like
Dr. Google is a huge tipping point in the conversations that we're having from a consumer
at what point, I mean, at what point do we have AI come in as a competitor to every single physician and every single medical entity that's out there? And is it going to live outside of the fiefdom, or is it or do you believe that it will eventually kind of become part of your day-to-day? I don't know what your thoughts on that would, Ben.
Yeah, so a lot there to unpack. And so just if I kind of, take off my compliance kind of like just outside of my job, right? Just like thinking like practically.
This is a safe space, Ben. Say anything you want. It's not like it's recorded.
Yeah.
So, the reality is, right, like people are putting tons of personal information into these models. And when you use a consumer model, right, when you use Gemini, you use ChatGPT, that data is irrevocably now the property of that language model. It's folded into the training data in a subsequent iteration. And and the reality is that because of that, these foundational model vendors have to put in a lot of controls in essentially what the prompt outputs can be, such that that data is fairly protected from, potential breaches. But it's still like, it's scary, right? And that like in healthcare, the concern is more like scale, right? Because it's like a breach could be really big, right?
Yeah, it's not one patient having their piece released. It's everyone within a specific wing of a hospital. And then,
right. And then like the potential for identity theft and stuff, right? There's a lot of like potential kind of damages that can, spin out from that. But I mean, I agree. Like I've use these systems and like, I'm not too worried about like my own personal information. But I'm a little cautious, and I do also have the advantage of having like enterprise systems available to me where I know that, the data doesn't get folded in, and I primarily use those.
Yeah. I mean, I think even in ChatGPT now they have like, they woke up to this kind of incognito mode where you can turn it off. Not everybody's going to do it, but I think eventually, I'm guessing that sophisticated models like OpenAI are smart enough to eliminate PII because they don't want to have liability either. And maybe that's where the regulation really starts to hit home is, and that's where also competitive advantage starts to hit, where a sophisticated model company like OpenAI says, hey, if I want to sell into the healthcare space, if I want to sell into the financial space, I've got to bake this into the model where I redact PII information. I look for social security numbers. I look for names, and I guarantee they're already doing this. And it's just like you mentioned, the culture lag of adoption is you have to convince the industry. But I also think that honestly, the consumers, it's either capture this opportunity and provide something of value, and certainly abide by a lot of the restrictions that you're talking about as far as what data can be shared. But I could see it where if it's not adopted and it's not leveraged within the internal healthcare system, I can almost see, it sounds kind of almost bureaucratic and silly, but I could almost see like you guys having to print out whatever documents you share with me. I could totally see like, hey guys, this is AI ready, like where it takes away all the information. It's almost like backwards thinking, like, because I know you're going to scan this into ChatGPT and ask it questions. We went ahead and cleaned it.
Here's the redacted option. Just pass it right in.
Right? Like you don't need to identify the patient for most use cases of AI, right? You can just be like, take off the name, any identifying information. And so, to your point around like redacting before putting in, AWS's platform, Bedrock, has this kind of guardrail system, and that is part of it, right? And you see like our orchestration platforms have the same, right? So there's a lot to be said for de-identifying before you pass anything, because it's just like an extra layer of control, even though you're not going to store the prompt data, right? You're encrypting in transit and at rest. An extra layer is just saying, well, let's just de-identify from the jump. But to your the point you were making about that experience, right, of having a more personalized experience and something that's really can be asynchronous, I think that's critical, because clinicians are so time constrained. And I know you guys do a lot of good work with it in terms of like having human in the loop, and potentially you can allow these systems to talk with patients at their leisure, in their own type of language, like explain it like I'm 5, explain it in terms of, give me a surfer analogy of whatever.
Yeah, translate into another language if that's English isn't my first language.
Yeah,
any
like
of that stuff.
You might have a first generation grandma that only speaks Italian.
and take your time and like pour over it, right? Like, oh, well, try it again, try to explain it a different way. Like, whereas like the clinician doesn't have time to do that, right? But then you can have a human in the loop kind of checking in to be like, did they say anything? Did the agent say anything wrong? Like, do I need to like intervene? And that's actually some of the
I'm about to walk back in as a
like,
doctor and I can get a quick synopsis. So I'm not just looking over a chart. It's like I'm seeing a quick breakdown of the last 2 hours, 3 hours since I've been in there of like everything that's been discussed and say, you know, hey, Mrs. So-and-so, you were asking some questions about this. Was all of that answered for you? And now I know what to address. Or am I just going in to provide like the high level piece again? And then your digital assistant is ready for any other questions you have. And it's going to speak in my voice. It's already had my sign off. You know, there's a lot of layers to it.
Yeah, the AI is only going to get smarter if it's able to understand and receive the data as from the actual clinician or the hospital. Because right now what's happening is the patient is re-describing. Now, in my case where I took a picture of the diagnosis, certainly that's pretty good. That's going to get you closer to the truth. But, you know, you can imagine a world where, and we're just talking about like very acute scenarios, but like we have this one, we're working on this one project with home healthcare. We're piloting some ideas around, imagine, you know, somebody who lives at home is maybe even has early onset of dementia or, you know, just is lonely, maybe has somebody who comes in and checks on them, but is for the most part by themselves, and being able to have them talk to AI and describe what's going on with them or how they feel, but having all that summarized and put into their profile so that their, you know, caretaker can understand and maybe even have like some escalation in there. Like, hey, I'm not feeling good. My head's really
certain triggers.
And that gets escalated to somebody who potentially could react to it. So I know we're talking about a very thin slice of like a one use case, but like, you know, medicine and healthcare is really about longevity and about, you know, beyond just like the hospital or the emergency room. I mean, this goes into my kids will be the first generation from when they're kind of in the, you know, early 20s where AI is now a part of their life, where they will be speaking to AI and building their profile with the AI. And also the AI will be feeding off their Apple Watch, will be, you know, understand their medical record, and will have everything. Like, I don't know, Lee, do you even have a medical record? Like, if I said, Lee, give me your medical record, do you know where it is?
No. And
yeah,
honestly,
I think I probably have one. I don't.
Yeah.
That was that's the biggest mystery in the world to me.
Anytime you change a GP and they're like, yeah, can you get that all forwarded over from the last one? I'm like, I guess.
I'll fax it.
Right?
Yeah. Like, I don't know. You're younger than me. Do you know where your medical record is, Ben? Like, I don't know. You're younger than me. Like, would you, if I said,
it resides with like the health system that I go to, right?
There's
a lot there that you kind of touched on that I want to like
hit on
jump in on, because I mean, to start from the first, you know, backwards, a lot of the regulations kind of like the direction is intended to essentially encourage interoperability and like making those health records available, especially to like patients. So right now, like FHIR is kind of the standard, and the mandate there is that, you know, any certified health system or health record can let a patient just like ask for their own information. Now it's not like 100% comprehensive, but that is the direction. But just trying to go back to, you know, when you were talking about, so one thing that I really, this concept I think is really important for people to think about, and this applies kind of globally to all AI kind of deployments, but especially in healthcare, it's important to think about like a risk spectrum, right? So, and in any scenario, the risk spectrum is like, hey, you know, how sensitive is the data you're handling, and how far are you from potentially causing harm? And when you think about, you know, use cases in healthcare, if you're advising a clinician on like the acuity of a patient, like how you know how to potentially treat them, right? That's like really high risk, because you screw something up, like bad things are going to happen. But the other end of that, right, is any sort of patient engagement, depending on the nature of the patient engagement, right? You can constrain it in a way to essentially the content that you're having a conversation with the patient about can be pretty low risk, right? Especially, and then you can mitigate the risk by having things like a human in the loop, right? Someone who can look over it. But like to the points that you're making, right, around, well, just if you've got like a specific, like a discharge document, right, or a care plan, here is what, you know, here's your situation, here's your condition, here's how we treated you, here's what you got to do. Mm-hmm. You can potentially give that to an AI agent and give it very strict rules, like don't get creative, mm-hmm. you know, like really like stick to this document,
Mm-hmm.
and here's some additional kind of educational materials, and then you can let the patient converse with that. You know, or even just like, I think there's really simple ways that health systems should be looking at kind of dipping their toes in the waters. And I actually think you guys do a really good job at Raya of making it easy to create agents with documents that can then be easily socialized by text, right? And people can use them pretty quickly. But you can just, if you really want to get like basic, you can just start with, help patients know where to park and help them like know,
Right.
how to, like, once you get to the hospital, like take a left.
Like
Appointment
pre-op,
concierge, yeah.
Yeah, like pre-op prep, post-op care, like stuff that's like kind of like templated on a brochure sitting in the lobby, right?
Or that
I wanted to touch on-
that slanted piece of paper they give you after surgery, and there is like, here's your protocol for the next 6 weeks, and this is the same thing since the 80s. That can easily be done.
It seems like to me like the rubber hits the road where in all this. I mean, yes, certainly everybody wants to protect private data, and I get all that, the rigmarole. But it seems like at the end of the day, it's like if the AI says something dumb to a patient and they do it and they die or they have irrevocable kind of pain or whatever, or it's like who's responsible for it? Like liability seems to be like really that's the bridge that needs to kind of be built, right? So do you think, based on kind of what you've heard, do you think that it makes more sense to just say, like it's almost like when I go and buy something like the FDA, like they put a big ass warning label on something, and if I put it in my mouth, they expect that I read the warning label and it is what it is, right? Like if I start drinking, like
think about what you're about to say, Rich. Don't,
if I start drinking bleach,
right?
I can't sue the bleach people, right? Because they put that warning in them. So I mean, could a simple thing be here? And I'm not even just talking about healthcare. I'm just talking about like across the board.
Rich just really wants to drink bleach.
Could a simple solution be here? Is like, if you're going to deploy AI in any sort of fashion, you have to notify the person, hey, you are speaking to AI. I could make mistakes. Trust but verify. I'm gonna, but do but you are you are agreeing that whatever I say is up to you on to take action, and so is not liable, right? It seems like that's like the first step, right?
And that is essentially I'd say the primary approach to the legislation. So the legislation, now it's kind of interesting, right? Because again, we don't have like really strong federal legislation, right? So it's like a few states have started to introduce bills, but we can see there's like 100 pending, state bills to legislate around AI, and it's not healthcare specific, right? Like healthcare is a subset of the larger kind of body of work, but the common theme is generally around transparency and bias awareness and control. And so because there's so many different like models, right? The bias piece is an interesting one. I want to touch on that. But the transparency element is essentially what you're describing, right? Where it's upfront, okay, this is AI, be buyer beware, right? Like, don't rely on it. It does hallucinate, you have to like verify. And then to expand on that transparency, you see like now the thinking models will like show their thought process. You can kind of like look like what steps did it take. That's like kind of like aligning with that paradigm of a best practice of like being more transparent about source material and thinking process. And then going beyond that, so in healthcare, we have this concept of predictive decision support intervention, which most certified health IT use cases of AI kind of, it gets a very broad net. And so most things fall into it. And you have to expose a number of source attributes additionally, so it's like upfront kind of like, hey, we're using AI, be aware, double check,
I agree.
Yada, yada.
Right.
Exactly. Like informed consent. But then you can expand it out. And then there's a bunch of extra stuff we got to tell you, right? So here is what this system was sort of intended for, right? The intended use cases, some of the like concerns, edge cases, the like source attributes of the model, right? So what like especially around training data or like what biases could be present. And so sometimes I think people struggle with like, what does that mean from like what people struggle like, how am I biased, right? So I think that with an AI, with a model, the concept of bias is essentially like, what was it trained on and how representative is the training data of the population that it's going to serve. So to make that like a really specific example, if you have a language model that is trained on OBGYN data, it is going to have a very strong bias. It is trained entirely on women's data, right? And so it'll be great at helping treat women, but it will not be good at treating men. And so that's like a really specific bias that, the users should be very acutely aware of.
Could I ask you a question on that, Ben? Because we've talked about this in other industries as well. So one of the ways that I tend to conceptualize this to clients with Rhea, and when you're looking at workflows that, again, let's say a patient workflow is going from I have a question about my information and then taking it all the way to my question has now been answered and complete workflow and then restart for my next question, right? It's not just A to B or even A to D. It's really this splinter that kind of brings it back in over time, back to what the running conversation is. So in a use case like that, and you have a specific practice that does OBGYN services, maybe it does mammograms, maybe it does a couple other things that are around women's health, right? Or you have a more broad practice that has, both men and women type roles that are being taken care of. Wouldn't it make sense in an AI perspective to have a conversational agent that lives on top of a team that basically, as information is gathered, it then says, I need to query against OBGYN data because of what we're talking about here in concept. And now I might be the one texting it for my wife, but I'm like, hey, by the way, I'm also a patient here and I have questions about XYZ. And then it goes, great, let me dive into, men's health on these topics. So do you feel like that's maybe where some of this is getting, again, muddied the waters a little, because we're conceptualizing this as there is an AI layer that does all of these things versus a team of AI physicians that are living there that are basically just getting activated as needed? Maybe that's where some of the disconnect is.
Love the concept. It really, it's kind of interesting because we're going to see the same patterns that we see with people, right? Because it's essentially, these are like agents, right? And so with a care team, you absolutely have that, right? You have a team of specialists that cater to different needs, right? There's not like a single, physician or specialty who kind of knows everything.
They all walk into the room and they all have their clipboards and they're talking to you about everything that's going on.
Right. And so absolutely, right, you're going to have these, and we're going to see this in like every industry, right, where you've got essentially like agentic orchestration, right, where you've got like an aggregator agent who's kind of front door, who's like, hey, tell me what's going on, right? And then you kind of behind the scenes, you parse it out and you say, okay, well, I got to pull in this expert and this expert and this expert, and then get disparate opinions. And that can also be a really interesting potential for creating bias mitigation, in that you can orchestrate back to a consensus, right? So you can essentially bump up, okay, I've got this situation. Let me ask, 5 different models that are different specialists and generalists, and then see what the consensus comes back at. Like, what do they mostly agree on? And that can be a good way to mitigate bias. But absolutely, I think that having like specific topical expert agents is definitely the way to go.
Yeah. And it seems like a lot of this will probably end up propagating to the edge too, right? So like, a lot of these models, I think they're starting to kind of build out the infrastructure, especially when you're talking about like Apple and Google, as far as the devices and mobile phones, where these models, especially, you can start building these smaller models that are, that live on the device, which allow you to kind of, I can create my own, it can represent me and have information about me that's isolated. It's not on the cloud, but kind of it's a run through, right? So the minute I start talking to another model, I can authenticate myself, or it would have access. I can allow it to have access to I'll call it my digital health record, but it's a multitude of things. It could be other things that are about me that beyond my health, but that could also be the context that is provided that allows for that bias to, kind of dissipate as well, because it has like much more context versus like some random guy chatting on ChatGPT. I could put in the initial prompt is, this is Rich Swire, this is his medical records, this is all the things he wants you to know, and then now provide way more better feedback, better guidance, and another thing too is, quite honestly, maybe another way to kind of completely look at this from a who knows how it's going to ultimately come to market, but another component of this could be that the medical professional, just like any professional out there that's using AI, is, the medical professional that somehow finds a way to leverage AI, but then like that human in the loop, be there and then provide the answer to the patient that's been kind of reviewed and still going through the proper channels instead of it being like patient to AI. It's more like medical AI combination. Then I provide it back to the patient in one singular result. It seems to be like the kind of no-brainer, which is probably happening, right? Like I mean, doctors are out there using, I mean, I know a bunch that are using ChatGPT to do certain things, and I'm sure it's helping them compile their information, and they're reviewing it. They're checking it just like if they had a nurse practitioner do it, and, they're double checking and things like that. But it seems like that's going to continue to grow. And then at some point, the consumer frustration will find a way where there'll be an inflection point where somebody will come out with something that's really transformative that maybe will unlock a lot of these challenges. But I mean, it's such an exciting, I mean, and I heard earlier you said a really solid point, and I think you reflected on it, which was, there's such a massive unlock here. Like if I were to if I was to say, how is AI going to transform us in the most powerful way, I would put all my eggs in healthcare. I think it's just not just from a services perspective, but from an innovation, from a drug development, all, longevity and understanding how, and also providing that kind of constant, and it's obviously getting smarter, but allowing humans to learn and become healthier. And that means in all aspects, what we eat, how we behave, how we work. That's even a bigger component, right? Like there's no way in 20 years I'm working 80 hours a week still, right? AI is going to help me work more efficiently, more effectively.
Sure. Only 70 at that point, right?
Exactly. I'll bring it down to 70. But like all these things that bring us back.
And ideally you're doing more things that you enjoy,
exactly.
Right?
So that's what I mean. It's transformative of like living a better life. And that goes obviously down to, it just seems like a massive like transformation as far as of what this technology can do. So I'm excited to see things happen in the actual healthcare market and how we can better services and deliver those things. But quite honestly, I think no matter what happens or how fast that happens or how quickly that it gets adopted, and all these regulations will start to dissipate at some point with, and to the fact that there's going to be such a big lift in innovation, and that I can't even imagine what it's going to look like. But I could foresee a whole new world created from this that certainly will maybe somehow tie back into our existing world, but at some level, I don't know. I mean, I just think in 20, 30, 40 years, it's just going to be,
it's transcending what we got right now.
Oh yeah, it's going to look totally different. And I don't know if we will end up with like a hard stop or anything, because I got a lot to say.
We're gonna have you back. We're gonna have you back either way. But why don't we give you kind of last word and throw a couple other things out there you want us to be thinking about?
So one thing I'm hoping to even mention just briefly on the just transforming work. There's a really interesting Harvard study that just a teaser, right? That I'd love to talk about that a little bit, but it's focusing on healthcare.
Yeah.
Hopefully we have time today, but we'll try to like jump around a little and get to it. But it's just thinking like just specifically healthcare, right? To that point of the potential. So, at Altera, like the vision that we kind of have, that we think that AI is going to be a huge part of, is first of all, like empowering patients, right? So really giving people the opportunity to have a better understanding of their care, of the options available to them, of their health plan, right? And having better access to their care teams, right? Through potentially asynchronous communication where, hey, I can just talk to like a chatbot, and then, that chatbot can then summarize the conversation and give it to the care team and be like, okay, here's everything the patient was concerned about. Here's what they said, right? You can review the raw, right, as well. And then, the clinician doesn't need to be like available, but then he can just, or he or she can then just go read and be like, okay, here's what I got to tell this person, or here's what I have to think about. So there's a lot of ways to empower patients that I think are, readily available to us. And in that regard, I really encourage health systems, to the point of like you were saying, someone's going to solve it all. Well, that may be true, but there's honestly right now, it's like we can start experimenting and dipping our toes in the water quickly. And I encourage people, especially health systems, not to wait for like, someone to just serve up a solution on a silver platter. Like get out there and start, trying these things, because there are a lot of systems available.
If you don't want to be left behind, you got to take some kind of action, right?
Exactly. And you can, again, with human in the loop, right? There's protections, right? There's ways to do it responsibly, but just start that journey, and you're going to kind of learn through that journey. the kind of second major part of our vision is to enable clinicians, right? And to enable clinicians to, as we said, like elevate their work, kind of overcome some of this administrative burden. Like you said, working 80 hours a week, maybe you'll still work 70, but you'll enjoy that 70 a lot more. And that actually dovetails into the Harvard study, where we're seeing now, like, people who use AI more are generally having a better time. Like, they're just enjoying their work more. They're getting more fulfillment. They're learning more while doing it. And specifically with like ambient listening and other these AI capabilities for clinicians can allow them, rather than spend time like keying away on the patient record, or looking at the patient record and trying to look through like 5 disparate systems or or looking at a fax, looking at like 5 different things to figure out that you can get a cohesive picture much more quickly, and then without having to document as much, you can then just have a conversation with the patient. And like, this is what a lot of clinicians became doctors to do, right? Like, they want to be healers of people. They want to help people, rather than like this dystopian nightmare of like just spending all their time looking at a screen and like having to go home and then spend hours on the screen as well to just keep up.
It's a nightmare. One of my good friends is a cardiologist, and she says like, oh, I'll have 500 patients easy. Like that's, I'm dealing with 500 patients at any one point in time. And on my mind, I'm like, I forget, because when you're a patient of a doctor, you're like, I don't understand why she didn't miss this or miss that. And you're like, she's got 500 people that literally are just like you. Like they're all and so like, I can't even imagine how you manage like, oh, hi, Mr. Smith, and then you have to look at the chart because you're like, oh wait, there was another person that was kind of had this same kind of condition, but and use it. So like this, the whole idea of AI is it really is to be empowering, and I think you're exactly right. Is this shift of mindset of like, if you could just unlock that and give AI and it could summarize, or you could just ask it like, I'm about to meet with. It's like this perfect assistant, right? I'm about to meet with Mr. Smith, and it gives you a summary, and then it goes, okay, yeah, I remember now. And it's really good at finding those things that you might be not be missing. And then, just going to allow them to spend more time with the patient and actually have real
build
impact.
true rapport. And
And I think, as part of that, right? Like, so and I'll say like the third kind of part of our vision is around kind of transforming care organizations. And this is where like, I think that there's potential. There's some really interesting like dreams here that can kind of be realized for these different stakeholders. But when we think about the industry as a whole and care organizations, when we talked, kind of early in this conversation about how, we can deploy AI into like all these different functional areas of a business to really automate, accelerate, and become more efficient. And when you start to see the aggregate of that, when you're using AI to help with billing and like kind of insurancing all the insurance, like all that, navigating all that kind of health shape, right? And streamline the clinician's interactions with the patient and like reduce their, administrative burden, reduce the kind of the front desk burden and allow patients to chat with agents more. You can see how you can have this really massive cumulative efficiency impact to where we can make healthcare, like we can transform care organizations to make healthcare more accessible, more affordable, such that more and more people can get access to the care they need. And we can thereby like have much healthier communities, healthier families. And this is not like a theoretical, like we're starting to see these efficiency gains now. And it makes me super excited for the future. Like like you said, like for our children, they'll have better access to care, and it's not going to cost them a fortune. And you won't have this fear of like, oh my God, should I go to the hospital, or like, cause it's going to bankrupt me, and like making these like really hard, like life and death decisions potentially, but because of the system that we have. I really think that AI will allow us to overcome a lot of the healthcare realities that we have.
Yep. That's a great place to end, because I think that's a good way to dovetail for our next time we have you on. We'll kind of dig into the more deeper, but I couldn't agree more. I think the quicker we embrace this, and honestly, I don't think it's up to the healthcare industry to embrace it as much as it is for us just as users. Like the more, like we run the world, people don't understand that, but we're the ones who kind of ultimately make decisions. So if we embrace it as consumers and we want a better healthcare system, then we need to be out there saying we want a better healthcare system and we love AI and we don't really care about, we will embrace and we want to be part of this solution, because the quicker we get it out there and people using it, the better it is for everybody. And that's just like any other technology, right? We everybody cared about privacy, but then everybody's sharing their photos on Instagram, and it seemed so it's like, who cares, right? Like, it's if people adopt it, everybody else will fall in line.
Yeah, as long as I can double click on Rich's health results, like, I'm in.
It's on my gram. I post all my health stuff on my Instagram.
Yeah, he just redacts a couple of lines, but you get the whole thing there.
Yeah.
Well,
Guess
Ben,
who it is, right?
Yeah. Ben, thanks so much for joining us. And for everyone else listening, thanks again for joining us on this episode. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button to stay in touch. Also, check out our Substack for more content, which will be linked to this episode to continue this discussion. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and we'll see you on the next episode. Take care, everyone.
Welcome to the show where air takes the floor.